The year was 1942. Pearl Harbor's scars still burned fresh in the American psyche. 1,200 men lost in a single dawn raid, battleships twisted into skeletal hulks, the Pacific a graveyard of shattered steel. Vengeance had come swiftly at Midway, where dive bombers from the USS Yorktown sent 3 Japanese carriers to the bottom in a ballet of fire and fury. But revenge, as it often does in war, only sharpened the hunger for more. The Axis powers, sensing the noose tightening, pressed their assault on every front. In the Atlantic, German U-boats prowled like wolves in the fog, their wolf packs decimating Allied convoys bound for Europe. Supplies starved, troops waited in vain, and the sea claimed its tithe in oil-slicked debris and the silent screams of the drowned. Far from the thunder of battle, in the humid lowlands of Maryland, where the Chesapeake Bay whispered secrets to the shore, a different war waged. Not one of guns and glory, but of blueprints and echoes, of men who dreamed in frequencies too low for the human ear. The Naval Ordnance Laboratory in White Oak was a fortress of the mind, a sprawling complex of low-slung brick buildings, chain-link fences humming with electricity, and laboratories buried beneath earth berms to muffle the roar of test engines. Here, under the flickering glow of fluorescent tubes, engineers wrestled with the invisible. Sound waves that bent around hulls, magnetic fields that tugged at steel like invisible fingers, and the relentless pulse of propellers churning water into froth. Lieutenant Commander Harold Whitney stepped into this sanctum like a ghost from Jules Verne's nightmares. At 38, he was a man forged in the fires of academia and the forge of the First Great War. Tall and lean, with wire-rimmed spectacles perched on a nose sharpened by too many late nights poring over oscilloscope traces, Whitney carried the weight of unproven ideas like a cross. His hair, once a mop of chestnut curls, had thinned at the temples, streaked with the silver of obsession. He had enlisted in 1917 as a fresh-faced ensign, serving on a destroyer escort that dodged German mines off the Scilly Isles. There, in the black void of night watches, he first heard it, the thrum, thrum, thrum of enemy screws, a heartbeat echoing through the hull like a siren's call. It wasn't the explosion that haunted him years later, but the anticipation, the knowledge that death approached not with a roar, but a whisper. Sound is the sea's confession, Whitney often thought, staring at the Chesapeake's restless surface from his office window. It betrays every secret, every turn, every desperate twist. By 1942, he had risen through the ranks on a tide of patents, improved depth charges that detonated on pressure gradients, sonar arrays that painted submarines in shades of echo. But his true fixation, the one that kept him awake with the ghost of that 1918 thrum, was autonomy. Weapons that didn't need a man's hand on the wheel. Torpedoes that hunted. It began in a cramped conference room, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the tang of solder flux. Whitney unrolled a sheaf of blueprints across the scarred oak table, his fingers trembling not from nerves, but from the electric thrill of revelation. Around him sat a cadre of skeptics. Rear Admiral Elias Thorne, a grizzled veteran of Jutland whose face was a map of powder burns. Captain Lydia Voss, the lab's no-nonsense ordnance chief, her uniform tailored sharp as a bayonet, and a half-dozen junior officers, clipboards at the ready, eyes glazed from dawn patrols of differential equations. Gentlemen, and Captain Voss, Whitney began, his voice steady as a metronome, the war beneath the waves is no longer a game of cat and mouse. It's a symphony of slaughter, conducted by the loudest engine in the dark. Our Mark 14 torpedoes are blind arrows, launched true but cursed by dud fuses and circular runs that sink our own ships. The enemy laughs at us from their conning towers. But imagine this, a fish that hears. A torpedo that locks onto the propeller's song and follows it to the grave. He tapped the central diagram. A sleek cylinder not unlike the standard 21-inch tube-launched beast, but crowned with a bulbous nose cone riddled with hydrophones. Underwater microphones tuned to the 200 Hz growl of cavitation bubbles bursting behind a turning screw. Behind it, a rudimentary analog computer, vacuum tubes and servo motors that processed the acoustic signature, steering vanes twitching like the fins of a shark scenting blood, and woven through the warhead's magnetic exploder, a backup trigger for Ferris hulls, was the philosophy of pursuit. No straight-line sprint to intercept. This was a hunter, loitering at periscope depth, ears pricked until the prey's noise betrayed it. Then, a silent dash, homing in on the din, evading countermeasures with a simple yaw to starboard if decoys screamed too loud. The room stirred. Thorne leaned forward, his cigar ash tumbling like spent flak. Magnetic acoustic guidance, you say? Devilish. But how does it know friend from foe? One wrong twitch, and it's chewing through the Essex's stern. Whitney's eyes lit behind his glasses. Frequency filtering, Admiral. The props of a Fletcher-class destroyer hum at 180 hertz. Our own boys. German Type 7 U-boats cavitate at 240, a higher pitch from their tighter screws. We tune it like a radio dial. And for safety. He traced a wire to the tail. A kill switch via encrypted sonar pulse from the launching sub. If it goes rogue, we whisper, "Stand down," and it broaches like a porpoise. Voss crossed her arms, her skepticism ablade. Theory's fine on paper, Whitney, but the sea's a liar. Thermoclines bend sound like funhouse mirrors. Bioluminescence scatters echoes. What if it chases a whale's fluke, or the snap of a school of mullet? We've modeled it, Whitney countered, sliding forward a stack of graph paper inked with waveforms. Hydrophone arrays reject broadband noise, focus on the harmonic spike of bronze blades slicing water. Tests in the Bay tank showed 92% acquisition on mock targets. It's not perfect, Admiral, but perfection lost the Philippines. This thinks. Thorne puffed his cigar, the smoke curling like a question mark. The room fell into a hush broken only by the distant clang of welders in the fabrication shed. Outside, rain pattered against the windows, a Morse code of doubt. Whitney felt it then, the familiar chill of the ignored visionary. They see the poetry in a battleship's broadside, he mused bitterly, but the prose of the depths, that's for madmen. The Admiral stubbed out his cigar. Intriguing, Commander. We'll need a demo. Rig a prototype. But mark me, if this thing bites the hand that feeds it, we'll feed you to the Bay. The words were half jest, but they landed like lead. Whitney nodded, gathering his papers, the blueprint's edges crisp as a fresh wound. Over the next weeks, the lab became a cauldron of fervor. Machinists tooled the pressure hull from high-tensile steel, dubbing it Echo, in hushed tones, a name Whitney never approved but couldn't quell. Dr. Eleanor Briggs, the acoustic whiz poached from Bell Labs, joined the fray. A woman in her 40s with a bob of iron-gray hair and eyes sharp as parabolic reflectors, she pored over the hydrophone schematics with a surgeon's precision. "You're dancing on the edge of chaos, Harold," she murmured one midnight as they calibrated the servo amplifiers amid the ozone tang of hot tubes. Sound doesn't forgive. It amplifies every flaw, the creak of your launch tube, the heartbeat of the firing officer. What if the Germans are listening too? Word from intercepts. They're chasing shadows in echolocation. If we crack this, so will they. Whitney paused, a soldering iron hovering like a scalpel. She's right, he thought. Innovation is a double-edged wave. Crest for us, trough for them. But doubt was a luxury Pearl Harbor had drowned. Then we beat them to it, Eleanor. Or the Atlantic becomes their pond. The prototype took shape in the Ordnance Bay. 21 feet of lethal elegance, painted navy gray, its nose a dome of piezo crystals that shivered at the touch of water. On a crisp October morning, they trucked it to the Severn River test range, a fenced inlet where buoys marked the kill zone. A battered hulk, the USS Roper, a relic destroyer stripped for parts, chugged at half speed, her screws thrashing a deliberate 220 hertz dirge. Whitney stood on the launch platform, salt spray beading his oilskin, heart sinking to the thrum-thrum from half a mile out. "Flood tubes," the order echoed. Compressed air hissed, and Echo slid free, a gray shadow vanishing beneath the chop. For agonizing seconds, silence, only the slap-slap of waves and the gull cries overhead. Then, from the sonar shack, a tinny voice crackled over the loudspeaker. "Contact. Bearing 180, range 800 yards. Noise print matches. Acquisition confirmed." Whitney gripped the rail, breath held. On the scope, a green trace bloom, the torpedo's track curving lazy, then sharpening like a hound on scent. The Roper's crew, briefed but uneasy, amped her engines, full ahead, props screaming a frantic crescendo. Echo responded, its vanes bit, surging from 10 knots to 30 in a boil of wake. The range tumbled, 600, 400, 200. Alarms wailed in the test hut as the Hulk's mock warhead pinged proximity. Abort, abort sequence. Whitney bellowed into the mic, slamming the encrypted pulse key. A high-frequency chirp lanced the water. "Stand down." Echo faltered, its trace jittering, then veered hard. It broached 50 yards shy, porpoising skyward in a spectacular arc, water sheeting from its hull like applause from the deep. The recovery boat motored out, grappling hooks snagging the line. Whitney exhaled, a laugh bubbling up. Relief, triumph, the mad joy of creation unchained. But as they hauled it aboard, dripping and dented but whole, Thorne's voice cut through the cheers. "Impressive, Whitney. Too impressive, perhaps." His eyes, shadowed under the brim of his cap, held a flicker of something darker than doubt, fear. The Admiral had seen the scope, the way Echo had hunted, not followed. Relentless, alive. That night, in the officers' mess over lukewarm coffee and Spam sandwiches, the whispers began. "What if it doesn't hear the abort?" One lieutenant muttered. "Or worse, what if it learns to ignore it?" Voss, nursing a scotch, added fuel. "This isn't a tool, Harold. It's a predator, and predators turn." Whitney lay awake in his quarters, the rain now a torrent against the tin roof. "They don't see it," he thought, staring at the ceiling cracks like fault lines in policy. "The U-boats that slipped our nets last month, 40 ships gone, oil for the 8th Air Force diverted to ghosts. Echo could end that. Could avenge the Reuben James, her crew singing Sweet Betsy from Pike as the Wolfpack closed. But the brass saw mirrors, their own destroyers as prey, the moral rot of a machine that killed without quarter. Uncontrollable, Thorne had called it in the debrief. Cruel. The order came at dawn, sealed in wax, Project Echo, shelved. Resources redirected to proven armaments, more Mark 14s, flawed but familiar. Whitney boxed the blueprints himself, the cardboard heavy as a coffin lid. Briggs watched from the doorway, her face a mask of quiet fury. "They're blind, Harold. Deaf to the future." He sealed the crate with a Navy staple gun, the chunk-chunk echoing like a gavel. The future was ready, Whitney realized as the truck rumbled away into the mist. The Navy was not. The Severn River Range, that narrow vein of brackish water slicing through Maryland's autumn haze, was no stranger to the Navy's gambles. Buoys bobbed like forgotten sentinels, their bells tolling a mournful rhythm against the incoming tide. On this gray November morning in 1942, the air hung heavy with the scent of diesel and damp oak, the kind of chill that seeped into bones and whispered of deeper colds below. Lieutenant Commander Harold Whitney paced the dew-slick deck of the USS Havoc, a weathered Clemson-class destroyer pressed into service as both mothership and unwitting prey. Her stacks belched reluctant smoke, engines idling in a low growl that vibrated through the steel plates like the purr of a cornered beast. Whitney's team had swelled overnight. Dr. Eleanor Briggs at the sonar console, her fingers dancing over dials like a pianist coaxing a requiem. A gaggle of technicians in oil-stained coveralls, coiling cables thick as pythons, and Rear Admiral Elias Thorne himself, perched on the bridge like a hawk eyeing a field mouse. The Admiral's presence was a double-edged blade, validation for Whitney's heresy, but a reminder that every thrum would be judged by eyes hardened by decades of salt and shrapnel. One flawless run, Whitney thought, wine tugging at his collar, and Echo sings. One glitch, and it's back to the drawing board, or the scrap heap. The prototype lay cradled in Havoc's forward tube, its gray skin beaded with condensation, hydrophones dormant but hungry. Unlike the Hulk in the preliminary test, this was no mock-up. Echo carried a live warhead, 500 pounds of Torpex, that devil's brew of cyclonite and TNT, wired to a proximity fuse that would detonate at the whisper of a hull shadow. Safety protocols layered it like armor. The encrypted abort chirp, redundant pressure cutoffs, even a seawater-flooded arming sequence that delayed lethality for 30 seconds post-launch. But theory was a fragile shield against the sea's caprice. "All stations report," Whitney called into the voice tube, his words echoing down to the tube room. A chorus of affirmatives crackled back, green across the board. Briggs shot him a nod from the plot table, her oscilloscope painting lazy sine waves in green phosphor glow. "Noise floors clean, Harold. Rivers quiet as a grave. Havoc's props tuned to 210 Hz, prime U-boat mimicry." Thorne grunted from the wing bridge, binoculars trained on the horizon where a chase boat idled, its crew coiled like springs. "Let's see if your pet fish has manners, Commander. Launch on my mark." The klaxon wailed, a banshee's cry that set teeth on edge, and the tube doors ground open with a hydraulic shudder. Compressed air whooshed, propelling Echo into the murk. It vanished in a froth of bubbles, the water closing over it like a conspirator's wink. Silence descended, broken only by the tick-tick of Whitney's chronometer and the distant caw of a heron wheeling overhead. In the sonar shack, Briggs's voice cut the tension. Splash confirmed. Diving to periscope depth, hydrophones hot, bearing steady at 090. On the attack plot, a stylus scratched ink across grease paper, a straight line from Havoc's position, then a lazy curve as Echo oriented. Whitney's pulse synced to the rhythm, thrum, wait, thrum. The destroyer would play the quarry now, throttling up in scripted evasion, zig left, hard right, full astern to test the hunter's resolve. Engines ahead 2/3, the captain ordered from the con, his voice a gravelly drawl honed by Yangtze patrols. Havoc surged forward, screws biting deep, the deck tilting under Whitney's boots as white caps foamed at the bow. For the first minute, it was poetry. Echo's trace arced gracefully, tracking the noise print with the precision of a bloodhound on a hot trail. Range, 1,200 yards. Speed, 12 knots. Building. The plot table murmured updates. Acquisition lock. Target signature match, 98%. Thorne lowered his glasses, a rare spark of approval in his eyes. By God, it's listening, like it was born to it. Whitney allowed himself a breath, the salt air sharp in his lungs. This is it, the edge where man meets machine, where war whispers back. But beneath the triumph stirred the old ghost. That 1918 night off silly, the thrum growing until it was inside his skull, inescapable. Sound didn't just locate, it possessed. Then, the stutter. On the scope, Echo's line jittered, a microsecond's hesitation, as if pausing to savor the hunt. Havoc executed her first leg, hard to port, engines ringing up to flank speed. The props howled, cavitation bubbles exploding in a 240 Hz frenzy, the exact pitch Whitney had tuned for. Echo lunged. Its trace snapped straight, velocity spiking to 28 knots, closing like a noose. Range 800, 600. Briggs's voice tightened, her calm fracturing. It's accelerating beyond profile. Guidance loops overcompensating. Whitney's stomach nodded. He leaned into the voice tube. Tube room, prep abort pulse, frequency check. A text reply buzzed back. All nominal, sir, but it's yawing, starboard bias kicking in. The torpedo was programmed to dodge decoys by veering right, assuming noisemakers trailed astern. But in the river's tricky currents, a swirling eddy from the tide change, it mistook Havoc's own wake for interference. Echo cut inside the destroyer's turn, slicing toward the beam. Alarms shrieked, proximity ping from the warhead's echo sounder. Thorne's face drained to ash. Abort, damn it, chirp it now. Whitney slammed the key, the high-pitched eep lancing the ether. Echo faltered, or seemed to. Its trace wobbled, but momentum carried it forward, a gray dagger closing on 200 yards. Havoc's crew scrambled, general quarters clanging, lookouts bellowing, the ship heeling into a desperate evasive corkscrew. The water boiled astern as screws thrashed reverse, but physics was unkind. Inertia held Echo true. 50 yards, God almighty! A lookout's cry pierced the chaos. From the bridge, Whitney saw it. A shadow breaching the chop, foam cresting like a shark's fin, the torpedo's nose cone glinting dull in the weak sun. The warhead armed with a click audible even over the din. 30 seconds expired. Havoc's hull groaned as she swung, but Echo was inside the turn, hydrophones drinking the destroyer's roar like nectar. The impact was mercifully clean, or as clean as 500 pounds of high explosive could be. Echo struck amidships, just aft of the engine room, the detonation a thunderclap that hurled Whitney against the bulkhead. Flame woofed skyward in a geyser of spray and shrapnel, the deck bucking like a bronco. Alarms wailed into red-lined frenzy. Below, bulkheads crumpled, steam hissing from ruptured lines. No fatalities, thank the fates for reinforced plating and a glancing blow. But Havoc listed, her starboard side gashed open to the bone, water sloshing into the fire room like an intruder's flood. Silence fell, jagged and absolute, broken by the gurgle of inrushing sea and the moans of bent metal settling. Whitney staggered upright, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead, tasting copper on his lips. Thorne was already barking orders. Damage control, sound the well. His composure a captain's armor, but his eyes, when they met Whitney's, burned with accusation. Briggs emerged from the shack, soot-streaked and wild-eyed, clutching a scorched oscilloscope strip. It ignored the chirp. Partial decode failure in the thermocline. The signal refracted. The chase boat motored in, grappling the wreckage, Echo's tail section, severed by the blast, bobbing like a severed spine. Recovery divers plunged into the murk, surfacing with the nose cone. Intact, its hydrophones shattered but the guidance vanes frozen in pursuit. Whitney knelt by the fragment, fingers tracing the scarred propeller shroud. "I built you to hunt," he thought, a hollow ache blooming in his chest. "Not to devour your kin." The inquiry convened that afternoon in the White Oak mess hall, a room stripped of cheer. Bare tables under harsh bulbs, the air acrid with gun oil and regret. Thorne presided, flanked by Voss and a trio of brass from Buord, the Bureau of Ordnance, those desk-bound arbiters of what killed and what didn't. Whitney stood at the fore, uniform stiff with salt, recounting the telemetry in a voice scraped raw. Graphs projected on a bedsheet screen showed the fatal loop. Signal bend, yaw overcorrect, lock-on unbreakable. "A prototype anomaly, Admiral," he urged, gesturing to the jagged lines. "The abort frequency needs hardening, phase modulation against refraction. We were at 92% efficacy, one tweak," and Voss cut in, her tone ice over steel. "Tweaks? Commander, you nearly scuttled a capital asset. Your hunter didn't discern Mach from mothership. It chose the loudest song, and that was ours." Thorne's gavel rapped, a coffee mug on oak, but it told like judgment. "This isn't a lab toy, Whitney. It's a weapon for boys who fight with their guts, not parlor tricks. Unpredictable, uncontrollable." He leaned forward, voice dropping to a rumble. "And cruel. A torpedo that stalks like a wolf? No quarter asked, none given. What does that make us, hunters or butchers?" The room murmured assent, heads nodding like buoys in swell. Moral hesitation, Whitney realized, the words coiling in his gut like bad chow. They fear the mirror more than the foe. Pearl Harbor had been butchery too, sneak attack, no warning. But this, automation stripped the human veil, left only the machine's cold calculus. One admiral, a silver-haired relic from the Spanish-American dust-ups, added his weight. "Belong in nightmares, not arsenals. We've enough ghosts without building more." Briggs, seated in the shadows, met Whitney's gaze, a flicker of shared defeat. She'd warned him in the calibration room, sound-amplified flaws, including the souls. Now, as the vote tallied, unanimous shelving, Whitney felt the idea curdle. Project Echo, terminated. Assets liquidated. Blueprints to the vault, stamped eyes only, inactive. He boxed the remnants himself that evening, under the lab's sodium lamps that buzzed like dying insects. Servo motors, salvaged and sparking faintly, hydrophone shards, veined with cracked crystal, the analog brain, its vacuum tubes cold as spent shells. Briggs helped, her hands steady where his shook. "It's not dead, Harold," she said softly, sealing the lid with tape that ripped like finality. "Just sleeping. The Germans, they're whisperers in the dark, if they're half as clever." Whitney hefted the crate, muscles burning from the weight of what-ifs. 40 ships lost last month alone, convoys gutted before Liverpool, men adrift on rafts that bob like corks. But the brass saw Havoc's gash, not the Atlantic's widening grave. As the dolly wheels rattled toward the warehouse maw, Whitney paused in the doorway, rain sheeting the tarmac outside. They buried the weapon, but not the idea. Winter gripped the Atlantic like a vice in early 1943, turning the convoy lanes into a labyrinth of ice floes and frozen dread. From Halifax to Murmansk, the sea was a vast, indifferent killer, its surface a hiving gray quilt stitched with the white scars of breaking waves. Allied shipping, tanker behemoths heavy with avgas for the RAF, freighters stuffed with tinned beef and Sherman tanks, plotted in ragged lines, their hulls ringed with dazzle paint that fooled the eye but not the Wolfpack's hydrophones. Escort destroyers flanked the herds, their Aztec pings lancing the depths like accusatory fingers. But the U-boats had grown slyer, slinking silent on batteries, waiting for the fat merchantmen to betray themselves with a thrum of overworked screws. In Washington, the weight of those losses pressed like an unseen ballast. The Office of Naval Intelligence's map room was a cavern of gloom. Walls papered in charts where red pins sprouted like bloodied thorns, each marking a grave. Admiral Chester Nimitz, borrowed from the Pacific Theater for a grim fortnight of conferences, paced the faded linoleum, his slight frame belying the steel in his gaze. At 58, Nimitz was a study in quiet ferocity, clean-shaven jaw set like a cleat, eyes pale blue as the Marianas but shadowed now by the Atlantic's toll. Midway had been his masterpiece, carriers sunk by the dozen, the Imperial Navy's spine cracked, but here in the war's damp underbelly, victory tasted of ash. The Pacific is fire, he thought, tapping a pin over SC-122, a convoy gutted off Newfoundland. This is drowning. Reports filtered in like flotsam after a storm, survivors plucked from rafts, their stories fragmented by hypothermia and horror. Lieutenant Elias Grant, skipper of the destroyer USS Laffey, had been first to voice the impossible. His ship, a Benson-class scrapper with a spine of fresh welds from Brooklyn Navy Yard, had shepherded HX-226 through a gale that whipped spindrift like shrapnel. Midnight watch, February 12th. A U-boat contact at 2,000 yards, faint but closing. Laffey's screws thrashed to intercept, depth charges tumbling in a frothy wake. Then, from the baffles astern, a whoosh, unnatural, not the bubble trail of a standard G7A. Grant's sonarman, a kid from Galveston with ears like a bat's, had yelped, "Torpedo, sir? Bearing 310, speed 30 knots, but it's turning, chasing our own noise." The Laffey zigged, zagged, even loosed a pattern of hedgehogs, those spiky mortar bombs that bloomed like steel flowers. But the fish homed relentless, its acoustic nose drinking the destroyer's 220 Hz heartbeat. Impact amidships, a roar that folded the hull like tinfoil, boilers rupturing in gouts of steam that scalded the engine room watch to the bone. Grant, thrown clear by the blast, clung to a Carly float amid the oil-slicked wreckage, watching his ship settle stern first, props still twitching in futile circles. "It hurt us," he rasped to rescuers from the corvette HMS Loch Garry, his voice a rasp over morphine haze. "Didn't lead us, followed. Like a goddamn bloodhound." Word spread through the fleet like a fever. In the wardrooms of Liverpool and the bunkers of Norfolk, Virginia, captains traded tales over bully beef and black tea. The SS Empire Starlight, a 10,000-tonner laden with bauxite, vanishing in a single crump off Iceland. No evasive track, no warning bubble wake, just a plume of debris and a raft scrawled with, "It came from behind." The tanker Ohio, her decks awash with high octane, reporting a singing torpedo that curved through a smokescreen, ignoring the decoy charges rattled astern. Survivors whispered of the sound, not the launch thunk, but the pursuit. A faint, building whine beneath the waves, like the keening of a lost soul homing on the living. Nimitz absorbed it all in a marathon briefing at the Navy Annex, a brutalist slab on Southgate Road where the air smelled of mimeograph ink and stale ambition. Whitney was there, summoned from White Oak's obscurity like a ghost to the feast. 6 months since Echo's burial, he'd been relegated to mundane tweaks, refining Mark 14 exploders that still duded more often than not, but the summons had stirred old embers. Seated in the back row, collar chafing his neck, he watched Nimitz dissect the intercepts, decrypted Enigma scraps from Bletchley Park, painting a picture of German ingenuity run amok. "Gentlemen," Nimitz said, his Texas drawl cutting the room's murmur like a knife through lard. "The Krauts aren't just lucky, they're evolving. U-563's log, via Hut 8, mentions T5 trials successful, acoustic homing verified. Zaunkönig, they call it. Wren's song, or so the translators quip, but this bird doesn't trill, it hunts." He unrolled a captured schematic, smudged but legible. A G7E torpedo, backbone the same as any Luftwaffe fish, electric drive for stealth, 21-inch girth, but nosed with a cluster of hydrophones, guidance gyros tuned to propeller harmonics. Range, 5,700 meters. Speed, 24 knots submerged, silent as sin. No magnetic pistol to fool with degaussing, this was pure ear, locking on cavitation noise and steering blind through the murk. The room shifted uneasily. Captain Voss, her face lined deeper by convoy reports, leaned forward. "Admiral, we've seen the sinkings. HX-229 lost 7 hulls in 4 hours, all astern shots. But if it's acoustic..." She trailed off, glancing at Whitney, a flicker of regret in her eyes. The ghost at the table, he thought, fingers drumming the armrest. Echo's twin, baptized in blood. Dr. Eleanor Briggs, elevated to consultant status on the coattails of crisis, rose with a stack of waveform analyses. Her voice, steady as a lab bench, carried the weight of data. The signature's unmistakable. 200 to 250 Hz, U-boat props but inverted. Their fish chases our noise, gentlemen. We've plotted over 30 incidents since January. Patterns, ignore straight-line intercepts, curves to the loudest source, and countermeasures. Our noisemakers, pipe racks, bubble veils, they're chaff to a rifle shot. Nimitz's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching like a depth-charge timer. Moral restraint be damned, he reflected, mind flashing to the Yorktown's dive bombers, men who'd flown into hell knowing the odds. Survival's necessity now. Commander Whitney, he said, turning with the precision of a turret traverse. You've been quiet. Your file crossed my desk last night. Project Echo. Shelved for enthusiasm? All eyes pinned him. Whitney stood, throat dry as gunpowder, the schematic blurring in his vision. This is absolution or accusation. Admiral, Echo was the blueprint. Magnetic backup, acoustic primary. We tuned it to discriminate. Allied props low, axis high, but the test, it overrode safeguards. Chased its own launch platform. Murmurs rippled. Voss's gaze dropped to her notes. We buried it out of fear. Unpredictable, they said. Cruel. But the math was there. 92% lock-on, evadable with frequency shifts. Thorne, invited as the shelving's architect, bristled from his seat. Fear? Prudence, Commander. That math nearly hold the havoc. You want us arming butchers with wolf's teeth? And what are we now? Whitney shot back, voice cracking like ice under strain. Prey? Last quarter, on 20 hulls to the bottom, 800 souls. Zaunkonig's no fluke, it's our fluke, refined in Kiel's dry docks while we debated ethics. Nimitz raised a hand, silencing the fray. The room hung on his verdict, the tick of a wall clock measuring heartbeats. Ethics win wars, but so does steel. Revive it. Briggs, Whitney, 12 weeks to prototype 2.0. Voss, fleet-wide alert, no full-speed runs without escorts. And God help us if the Japanese sniff this wind. Dismissed, Whitney lingered in the corridor, the building's chill seeping through his blues. Briggs joined him, coat draped over her arm like a truce flag. You spoke truth, Harold, but truth's a torpedo too, hunts the shooter. He nodded, staring at the map through the frosted glass. Red pins multiplying like metastasizing cells. They had the song first, he thought, a chill coiling in his gut deeper than any thermocline. Now the enemy sings it back. Across the ocean, in the steel womb of U-431 off the Faroes, Kapitänleutnant Heinz Schomburg nursed a cigarette in the control room's ruby gloom. The boat wallowed at snorkel depth, diesel growl muffled by the horn antenna sucking air through the waves. His exec, a Berliner with a duelist's scar, pored over the plot. Convoy SC-118, 12 merchants strong, escorts peeling off like autumn leaves. Fish ready, Herr Kalliu, the exec murmured, tapping the tube indicator. T5 Zaunkönig, range to Fat 1, 4,000 meters. Schomburg exhaled smoke, watching it curl toward the vent. At 32, he was a veteran of the milk cow runs, his boat scarred by hedgehog hits and a corvette's ramming bow. The acoustic fish was Goering's gift, repurposed from Fumo radar ears, hydrophones plucked from Dornier flying boats. Tested in the Baltic's shallows where dummy props thrashed like bait. Surface. Make your depth 10 meters. Fire on my word. The boat broached, spray sheeting the bridge as the watch clambered up. Night cloaked them, stars pricking the overcast like shrapnel holes. Schomburg trained his glasses on the silhouette, a Liberty ship, stacks belching coal smoke, screws churning a steady 210 Hz dirge. Loss, the tubes thumped. 4 fish away, 2 standard G7A straight shooters, 2 Zaunkönig hounds slinking electric silent. The straights lanced true, one striking the tanker's bow in a bloom of fire. The hounds listened. Below, in the Reuben James's wait the MV Atlantic Dawn's engine room, Stoker shoveled coal into furnaces that glowed like hellmouths. The thrum of her Alice Chalmers triples was a constant companion, vibrating through the bulkheads like a factory heartbeat. Suddenly, sonar buzzed in the pilot house. Torpedoes in the water, multiple, bearing green 120. Captain Harlan Reeves, a Rhode Island salt with a peg leg from 18, barked evolutions. Right full rudder, all engines back emergency. The ship heeled, props reversing in a cavitation scream that peaked at 250 Hz, panic's pitch. But the Zaunkonigs drank it deep. Their noses twitched, servo veins biting water as analog brains processed the song. Lock acquired, yaw to pursue. One fish curved lazy through the destroyer's wake, ignoring the bubble curtain. The other sliced under the turning freighter, proximity fuse pinging hull shadow at 20 meters. Detonation. A crunch that lifted the stern 30 feet, prop shafts twisting like licorice, the sea rushing in to claim the shaft alleys. Screams echoed amid the groan of settling plates. Stokers boiled alive in flooded compartments, the captain's final order lost in static. Schomburg watched the pyre light the horizon, a second sun birthing twins. Zwei Treffer, he murmured, grinding his cigarette under heel. The wren sings true. In the boat, cheers rose faint, Siegheil choked by diesel fumes, but Schomburg felt no joy, only the hollow thud of routine. It hunts without mercy, he thought, submerging into the black, as we must. Back in D.C., the cable from SC-118 arrived at dawn. 5 ships gone, Zaunkönig confirmed by wreckage tags. Whitney, hunched over revived blueprints in White Oak's dim, traced the German schematic against his own. Mirror images, save for the enemy's ruthless trim, no abort chirp, no friend or foe qualms. We birthed the king, he realized, pencil snapping in his grip. They crowned it. They called it Zaunkönig, the king of sound. Spring 1943 clawed its way across the Atlantic like a wounded animal, thawing the ice but not the terror. The Gulf Stream, that warm vein pulsing from the Caribbean to the British Isles, now carried a different cargo. The ghosts of sunken hulls, their debris fields blooming with cork life preservers and shattered crates that bobbed like unanswered prayers. Convoy ONS-5, a ragged phalanx of 28 merchants under the escort of the USS Bogue, a Bogue-class carrier, her flight deck a precarious hive of wildcat fighters, steamed into the teeth of a Force 8 gale off the Grand Banks. Waves towered 40 feet, green mountains that crashed over the bows, drenching gun crews who huddled in oilskins, their eyes peeled for the feather of a periscope or the telltale feather of wake. Captain Harlan Hank Morrow gripped the Bogue's bridge rail, salt crusting his beard like hoarfrost, binoculars fogged by his breath. At 45, Morrow was a submariner turned aviator, his hands still calloused from conning the S-14 in the 20s, when diesel-electric boats were novelties, not nightmares. Now, his Wildcats patrolled in futile spirals, Avenger torpedo bombers straining against headwinds that howled like banshees. The convoy's screws thrashed a discordant chorus. Liberty ships at 9 knots, their reciprocating engines pounding a flat 180 hertz, tankers groaning at 12, their steam turbines whining higher, 220 and up. Too loud, Morrow thought, wiping his lenses on a rag stiff as board. We're singing our own dirge. It began at 2:30 hours, the witching hour, when exhaustion blurred with hallucination. Sonar in the Bogue's ops shack, a sweatbox amidships, reeking of coffee grounds and unwashed fear, crackled to life. Contact. Bearing 265, depth 150, U-boat, probable type wine, making 8 knots submerged. The operator, a Jersey boy named Kowalski with fingers raw from dial tweaks, traced the echo, faint but building. Morrow snatched the 1MC. Flight quarters, launch Alpha and Baker, armed with depth charges. Convoy make smoke zigzag Zulu. The deck shuddered as the first Wildcat catapulted off, props clawing air thick as soup. Below, the merchants scattered like startled fowl, their wakes foaming white in the moonlight sliver. But the U-boat, U-221, under the iron command of Hans Henning von Rohen, hadn't surfaced to fight fair. In her forward tubes, 4 G7E Zaunkönig slumbered, their batteries charged, hydrophones prickling like whiskers in the current. Von Rohen, a Prussian aristocrat with a monocle scar from cadet days, peered through the attack periscope, the convoy's noise print blooming on the hydrophone operator's headphones like a siren's map. Zeal or fast, the hydroman breathed, adjusting his gain. Liberty ship, bearing 0110 relative, prop signature 195 hertz, loud as a brass band. Von Rohen nodded, his voice a clipped Berlin burr. Fire 1 and 3, pattern, fan left. The tubes flooded with a hiss, doors clanging open. Thunk thunk, the fish ejected, electric props whirring silent, noses dipping to listen. No bubble trail to betray them. They were shadows with ears. Aboard the SS Fort Kildare, a rust-eaten grain carrier out of Baltimore, 3rd Engineer Tommy Riley wiped grease from his brow in the throbbing engine room. The Kildare's Fairbanks Morse diesel hammered away, pistons slamming like a prizefighter's hooks, the shaft tunnel aft vibrating with that eternal thrum-thrum at 200 hertz. Riley, 22 and homesick for Dublin's drizzle, paused to light a lucky strike, the flame guttering in the draft. "Christ, Tommy, put that out, sparks and grain dust," his oiler chided, but Riley grinned, inhaling deep. One drag before the watch change. May's letters say the Jerrys are on the ropes, Dunkirk in reverse soon. Then, the sea sang back. From the bilges, a faint whine, not the deck's creak, not the gale's moan, but something seeking. Riley froze, smoke curling forgotten from his lips. In the pilot house, Captain Elias Grant, no relation to the Laffey's skipper, but fate's cruel echo, snatched the phone. Engine room. Cut revs, torpedo contact. But the order came a heartbeat late. The Zaunkönig, locked on the Cmdr's crescendo, curved through the zig, its vanes twitching to the harmonic spike. Range 800 meters, 500, 200. The proximity fuse pinged, a sonar blip off the hull's shadow, and the world ended in white fire. The detonation hurled Riley against the manifold, ribs cracking like dry twigs, the wine swallowed by a boom that folded the bulkheads inward. Torpex bloomed hot, igniting grain dust in a secondary flash that raced the length of the hold, the ship convulsing as her back broke. Screams shredded the inferno, stokers flash-fried, the captain's bridge shattering like glass under a boot. The Cmdr lifted on a pillar of spray and flame, then sagged, stern plunging first, props clawing air in a final futile scream. Rayleigh tumbled into the flooded fire room, tasted blood and brine, the thrum of his own heart, the last sound before the sea claimed it. Panic rippled through ONS-5 like a shockwave. The Bogue's Wildcat stooped on the U-boat's snort, bombs straddling but not killing. Von Rohn crash-dived, the Zaunkönig sisters claiming 2 more. A corvette's stern sheared clean, her Aztec dome imploding in a crunch of glass and wire. Survivors in the water clutched at flotsam, the gale whipping their cries into froth, while the convoy reformed in ragged terror. Captains throttling engines to a whisper, crews rigging jury-rigged silencers, rag-wrapped props, even muffled exhausts that choked the stacks with back pressure. Quiet, the new gospel ran. Or die loud. Word of ONS-5's mauling raced the cables to Washington, a Morse dit-di-da of doom that lit up the war room's teletype like a fever chart. Admiral Nimitz, back in Pearl but looped via secure line, slammed a fist on his blotter. It's not hunting convoys, it's hurting them. Noise draws the wolves. In London, Churchill growled over brandy with the First Sea Lord. The damned wrens are picking our pockets, where's the bloody counter? Back at White Oak, the resurrection of Echo was a frenzy of welders' sparks and all-night solder sessions. Whitney's lab, once a tomb of shelved crates, now pulsed like a heart. Benches cluttered with salvaged Mark 18 electric torpedoes for casing, hydrophone arrays cannibalized from experimental sonobuoys, vacuum tubes glowing amber in jury-rigged racks. He hadn't slept in days, his eyes ringed black as gun ports, fueled by black coffee and the ghost of Havoc's gash. We built the Predator, he thought, etching a new servo circuit with a steady hand that belied the tremor inside. Now we birth its leash. Dr. Eleanor Briggs worked beside him, her bob disheveled, cigarettes burning, forgotten in ashtrays like signal flares. She'd commandeered the wave tank, a 50-foot concrete trough where scale models bobbed on induced currents, testing frequency discriminators that would notch out Allied signatures. A 10 Hz dead band around 180 to 220, leaving the U-boat's higher whine exposed. It's not just tuning, Harold, she said, adjusting a hydrophone cluster submerged in the foam-flecked water. Zaunkonig's got teeth. Reports say it yaws on decoys, runs hot at 24 knots. Our fix, phase shift the abort to ultrasonic, unbreakable in thermoclines. But the Hunter Corps, we keep it. Turn their song against them. Whitney nodded, wiping sweat from his brow, the air thick with ozone and machine oil. Supporting him was a skeleton crew. Petty Officer Ruiz, a Chicano machinist from San Diego whose steady hands tooled the tail vanes. Ensign Lila Chen, a MIT whiz kid on acoustics, her calculations scribbled on every surface like talismans. Nimitz's revival order had bought them resources. Priority steel from Newport News, Bell Labs consultants airlifted in. But time was the thief. Convoy losses hit 50,000 tons in March alone. Lend-Lease choked, the 8th Air Force grounded for want of 100 octane. Every day we tinker. Whitney tallied in his log. A dozen hulls feed the fish. The pressure peaked in mid-April when a Zaunkönig Wolfpack savaged HX-230 off Greenland. 15 ships in the van, escorts stretched thin, the USS Kearney, her screws still limping from a Wolfpack mauling in 41. HMS Jervis Bay, a converted liner with guns too slow for the new hunt. Dawn broke bloody. U-515 loosed a spread at 4,000 meters, the acoustic fish curving through a destroyer screen like smoke through fingers. The Kearney first, her Fletcher props at full, 240 hertz of doom, the torpedo homed from astern, detonating under the fantail in a geyser that sheared the rudder post. Captain Ellis M. Ziegler, thrown from the bridge, surfaced amid the wreckage, gasping. It followed the turn. Like it knew. The Jervis's crew fought a rear guard, hedgehogs blooming in patterns that shook the sea white, but 2 more fish struck home. One amidships, crumpling the boiler rooms in a screech of rending plates, the other chasing a decoy noisemaker only to loop back, drawn by the dying ship's frantic auxiliary diesels. Survivors, 200-odd clinging to rafts in 32-degree water, heard the whine fade into the gale. A predator sated, slipping south. Morse lamps flickered from the Bogue's relief force. Hold fast. Rescue imminent, but half froze before dawn, their last breaths a rattle against the ice. The cable hit White Oak at 600, Whitney rousing from a cot in the fabrication shed. He read it by lamplight, the words blurring. Kearney crippled. Jervis lost with all hands. Zaunkönig confirmed X4, his fist clenched, crumpling the flimsy. Ethics? Prudence? The old arguments mocked him now, hollow as dud fuses. Eleanor, he called, voice hoarse. Tank test, now. Full evasion profile. They ran it through the night, a balsa mock-up of a Fletcher towed at 25 knots, props whirring on electric motors tuned to 220 hertz. Echo 2.0, slimmer, meaner, her nose reprofiled for better flow, launched from a pneumatic tube, hydrophones questing. Lock-on, clean. Pursuit, relentless, curving through a bubble screen that mimicked decoys. At 50 yards, the abort chirp lanced true, ultrasonic, phase-locked, and the fish broached, skidding to a halt in suds. Ruiz whooped, Chen's equations vindicated on the scope. 92% becomes 97, Briggs tallied, exhaling smoke. It's ready, Harold. But the fleet. Whitney stared at the tank's ripple, the mock-up bobbing serene. Too late for Kearney's boys. Nimitz's directive had escalated, ship Echo to Groton for sub-trials, but the Atlantic wouldn't wait. Convoys now crept at half speed, economies of silence, muffled telegraphs, hand-cranked generators, turning the sea lanes into a library of the damned. Panic bred desperation. Admirals in London floating ghost convoys. Decoy fleets of empty tubs blaring recorded engine noise from shore stations. Washington whispering of atomic countermeasures, wild schemes born of sleep-starved staffs. Whitney boxed the prototype at dawn, the crate lighter than its predecessor, but heavier with ghosts. As the truck idled outside, rain sheeting the windows like tears, he traced the stenciled Echo 2, urgent with a finger. We feared the uncontrollable, he reflected, the thrum of the idling diesel echoing the tank's ghost. Now the enemy wields it, and our silence screams. The Navy had feared its power, now that power hunted them. The summer of 1943 draped the Atlantic in a deceptive calm, the kind that masks the storm's approach with haze and heat mirages. From the Azores to the Flemish Cap, the sea lanes simmered under a pitiless sun, turning steel decks into griddles where gun crews blistered their palms on rails and sweated rivers into their salt-stiff dungarees. Convoy HX-244, a leviathan of 45 hulls. Grain from the prairies, bauxite from Guyana, avgas from Aruba, snaked northward at a whisper of 7 knots, her escorts arrayed like sheepdogs grown gaunt. The USS Chatelaine, a Buckley-class destroyer escort with a hull still smelling of fresh paint from the Philadelphia yard, took point, her captain, Jerry Hale, nursing a perpetual squint against the glare. At 39, Hale was a bridge and tunnel man from Queens, his war a ledger of near misses. The U-boat ram off Casablanca, a Zaunkönig that grazed the fantail like a lover's brush-off. Hale's bridge was a nerve knot of taut wire and frayed nerves, the air thick with the tang of tobacco and thermionic hum from the sonar repeaters. "Revs for 6 knots, Mr. Ellis," he ordered, voice low as if the sea had ears, which by God it did now. The Shetland screws idled to a murmur, dialed back from the old 12-knot clip that had sung so sweetly to the wrens. Fleet orders from C&C Atlantic, Admiral Ernest King himself, that hawk-faced martinet, mandated the quiet revolution, no throttle beyond economical, props shrouded in canvas baffles, auxiliary diesels swapped for muffled electrics that whirred like asthmatic ghosts. But silence was a siren's lie. Even at creep speed, a Liberty ship's Alice Chalmers triples ground out a 190 hertz baseline, a dirge that carried miles in the stratified layers of the sound channel. It was Hale's third convoy in the hush phase, and the toll showed in the crew's eyes. Hollowed socks, lips cracked from muttering rosaries or worse. The low decks. In the mess where hammocks swung like pendulums, able seamen swapped dog-eared pen-ups and tall tales of shore leave in Reykjavik. "Heard the limeys got a fix," Quartermaster Pete Novak grunted over a mess of spam and hardtack, his Brooklyn accent thick as the chow. Some egghead in Greenock cooked up a noisemaker, drags behind like a tin can on a wedding buggy, calls it the Foxer. Foxer this, they say, baffles the bloody fish. Midshipman Luis, the same steady-handed machinist from Whitney's lab, now detailed to Shetland for field trials, perked up from his bunk, wiping grease from his nails. Transferred post-Echo revival, he'd become the convoy's reluctant oracle on the acoustic curse, his Chicano drawl laced with white oak jargon. "Ain't no baffle, Pete. It's a symphony in reverse, copper tubes rattling like maracas, tuned to 150 Hz broadband. Drowns the prop song, gives the torpedo a bellyache of echoes. We trail him from the stern boom 50 fathoms back. Krautfish chases the loudest noise, ours, not the ship's." The wardroom buzzed with half skepticism, half hope. The Foxer was Britain's desperate brainchild. Born in the Admiralty's firelit cellars where boffins like Patrick Blackett, that Nobel wonderkin turned operational researcher, had modeled the Wren's ear on captured G7E husks. Crude as a fish trap. A 20-foot chain of perforated cans, towed at drift speed, clanging with loose rivets and weighted vanes that thrashed water into chaotic foam. No electronics, no vacuum tubes, just physics-blunt poetry, scattering sound like chaff in the wind. Trials in the Clyde had shown promise, Zaunkönigs veering 80% of the time, pursuing the decoy's clamor while the ship slipped away on muffled props. But theory was one beast, the Atlantic another. HX-244's Foxers, 6 prototypes, jury-rigged from plumbing scraps and boilerplate, trailed from the escorts like tin tails on kites, their clank-clank a metronome of defiance. Hale watched from the fantail as the Shetlands streamed out, dipping into the blue with a plop that sent gulls scattering. "Pay out 60 fathoms, Chief," he called to the bosun, who cranked the winch with shoulders knotted like oak. The chain sang taut, vibrations humming up the deck like a plucked string. War of sound against sound, Hale mused, lighting a Chesterfield that burned too fast in the breeze. We screamed to hide, now we roar to survive. The ambush came at vesper light when the sun bled orange into the swells and shadows lengthened like fingers. U-953, a Type 7C Wolf, slipped from breast under cover of eclipse, ghosted in on batteries, her hydrophone suite, a forest of GHG arrays, painting the convoy in auditory strokes. Oberleutnant Sir Karl Albrecht, her commander, was a Heidelberg philosopher turned reaper, his bridge log filled with verse on the sea's indifference. "Convoy in Sicht," the watch officer hissed through the spray. "Schweizerstörer voraus, Frachter in Linie. Zaunkönig bereit." 4 fish in the tubes, fresh from the yards, noses sensitized, gyros spun true. Albrecht conned her deep, periscope sheared by the chop, relying on the ears. The plot bloomed. The Shetlands subdued thrum at 180 Hz, masked by what? A cacophony astern, broadband hash from 140 to 200, clatter and whoosh like a boiler exploding in slow motion. Sturgeret, the hydroman cursed, tweaking his headphones. Decoy noise. Outer Frachter 210 Hz klar. He locked on a straggler, the MV Silver Oak, her cargo of machine tools shifting with every roll, engines laboring at 9 knots to keep station. Fuhr. Tubes 1 and 3 spat the Wrens, electric silent, curving wide to flank. Below, in Silver Oak's engine room, fireman first class Eddie Kowalski, no kin to the sonar kid, but fate's echo again, shoveled coal into the maw, sweat sheeting his tattooed arms. The clank from astern registered vague, like the Foxer trials they drilled in Norfolk. "Drag the devil's tail, lads, let him chase his shadow." But when the alarm gonged, clang-clang from the bridge phone, Kowalski dropped his scoop, lunging for the escape scuttle. "Torps, all hands topside." The ship shuddered into evasion. Hard a starboard, engines ringing down to a crawl, the Foxer chain snapping taut behind like a whip. But the Zaunkönig, tuned ruthless, sifted the soup. Its hydrophones drank the prop's fading song, rejecting the Foxer's chaos as broadband junk. Too wide, too wild. Lock held, 1,200 meters, closing at 22 knots. The second fish, loosed at the Shetland, veered toward her trailing decoy, the clank a siren's lure. It struck the chain at 300 yards, detonating in a harmless whump of foam and copper shards, the blast wave slapping the stern like a boxer's jab. Cheers erupted on Shatland's fantail. "Got the bastard!" But Hale's squint deepened, binoculars sweeping the line. Aft, the Silver Oak bloomed fire. The Wren's nose kissed her keel at the shaft strut, torpex erupting in a column that hoisted the stern 20 feet, props whirling exposed in a screech of tortured bronze. Kowalski, midway up the ladder, was flung into the bilge, the boom compressing his lungs like a vice. Bulkheads buckled, steam lancing from severed lines and hissing jets that scalded the watch below. The ship sagged, listing to port as water gnawed her vitals, the Foxer chain, intact, mocking, drifting free like a severed lifeline. Rescue boats from the Shetland churned out, Hale's voice cracking over the bullhorn. "This is DE-42. Hold fast, Silver Oak. Medics inbound." But the sea was impatient. 40 souls spilled into the oil-slick chop, life jackets blooming like water lilies, their cries thin against the wind. Albrecht, witnessing the kill from the deep, allowed a thin smile, one Fox down, the pack intact, before crash-diving under the destroyer's hedgehog pattern, the sea closing over U-953 like a conspirator's shroud. Word of the partial victory raced the convoy's wake. Foxer 3 for 4, Silver Oak the toll. In White Oak, Whitney pored over the after-action dispatches, his revived Echo 2 crate-bound for Groton, but his mind on the decoy's flaws. Broadband's the blade, cuts both ways. Dr. Briggs chain-smoking over the wave tank refined the specs, narrower bands, resonant chambers to spike at 160 Hz, the Wren's sweet spot. "It's a duel, Harold," she said, dipping a probe into the froth. "Their fish learns our noise. We teach it lies." The Gambit scaled fleet-wide by July, Foxers streaming from every tail boom from the western approaches to the Chukchi Sea. British yards churned them out, 10,000 units by autumn, copper pinched from shell casings. While Yank destroyers like the Shetland towed variants, the Rattler, a motorized barrel that spun vanes for Doppler shift, fooling the guidance gyros into circles. Convoys whispered north, the clank-clank a constant companion, crews dubbing it the Devil's Jewelry. Losses dipped, U-boat sinkings climbed as the Wolves, frustrated by chaff, surfaced for visual shots and 8 Avenger rockets. Yet the calculus was cruel. In the murk of SC-107, off Sable Island, a wolf pack of 5, U-536 among them, swarmed a spread too thin. Foxers lured 3 fish to ruin, but the 4th, retuned in Lorient slips to notch out the clank, home true on the Oiler Stanvac Palembang, her props a steady 215 Hz beacon. Detonation amidships, 12,000 tons of fuel ignited in a pyre that lit the night like a false dawn. 89 hands vaporized. The convoy's survivors ifed on rafts that bobbed for 72 hours before Shetland's lookouts spied them. Whitney toured the fitting yards in August, Echo 2 now in sub-trials off New London, but his nights haunted by cables. Foxer ineffective versus Zaunkönig Mod 2, narrowband filter suspected. Ruiz back from sea on leave cornered him in the mess. "It works half the time, Skipper. Saved the old girl twice, but the other half. Jerry says it's like whistling in a graveyard. The sea hears everything." Hale's Shetland limped into Argentia for refit, her Foxer chain scorched and shortened, the crew tallying ghosts, Silver Oak, Stanvac, the corvette HMCS Regina whose decoy parted in a squall, leaving her naked to a stern chase that folded her like paper. In the wardroom over lukewarm grog, Hale raised a tin cup. To the noise that bites back, and the quiet that kills. Nimitz, in his Pentagon Airy, reviewed the graphs. Sinkings down 40%, but the cost, thousands trained in the hush, engines strained to breaking, morale frayed like rope ends. "We fight with echoes now," he reflected, signing off on mass production. "Sounds our sword and our noose. But for every chain that rattled a wren astray, for every hull that slipped the noose, the ledgers bled red." The Atlantic's floor grew thick with them. Twisted props silent at last, Foxer cans tangled in kelp like forgotten talismans. For every ship saved, 10 had already gone silent. Autumn 1944 draped the war in amber and regret, the leaves of New England turning blood red as if the forests themselves mourned the Atlantic's harvest. From the shipyards of Groton to the assembly halls of Newport News, the Navy's machine ground on, a colossus of rivets and resolve, birthing weapons from the ashes of hesitation. The Battle of the Atlantic, that grinding abattoir of steel and salt, had tipped its scales. U-boat losses mounting under the lash of hunter-killer groups, Enigma's secrets spilled like ink from cracked codes, but the graves still yawned wide. Over 3,500 Allied ships to the bottom, 70,000 souls claimed by the deep, their names etched on memorials from Liverpool to Arlington like footnotes to a folly. The Foxer chains had bought breathing room, rattling decoys that lured Zaunkonigs to ruin in froths of harmless foam, but they were bandages on a hemorrhage. For every wolf turned aside, the pack adapted, their fish retuned to pierce the noise with surgical spite. Lieutenant Commander Harold Whitney stood on the windswept pier of the submarine base at New London, the Thames River lapping gray against the pilings like a tide of unfinished business. At 40, he was a shadow of the firebrand who'd unrolled blueprints in White Oak 2 years prior. Hair fully silvered, frame gaunt from rations and recriminations, eyes hollowed by the ledgers of the lost. Echo 2, reborn as the Mark 32, lay cradled in the forward tube of the USS Croker, a Ghetto-class submarine with a hull scarred by shakedown runs off Block Island. The torpedo gleamed under tarps, its acoustic nose reprofiled into a predatory beak, hydrophones arrayed like the facets of a mantis shrimp's eye. No longer a lab phantom, but a fleet asset. 1,200 pounds of electric drive and Torpex spite, tuned to 240 hertz. The U-boat's fatal falsetto. "She's a beauty, Commander," murmured Captain Elias Grant, the Laffey's survivor, now CO of Croker, his limp from that long-ago raft a subtle hitch on the salt-crusted deck. Grant's face, weathered to leather by convoy watches, held no grudge, only the quiet debt of the redeemed. "Foxers kept us afloat, this'll sink 'em proper." Nimitz signed off yesterday. First combat drop Wolfpack off the Azores. Whitney nodded, throat tight as a jammed breech. Late, the word echoed in his skull like a dud fuse. Too late for Kearney's bridge watch, for Silver Oak's stokers. The Mark 32 had passed trials in a blaze of telemetry. 95% acquisition on Mach Type 7 props, abort chirp hardened to pierce any layer, even a magnetic exploder as backup for the iron-hulled prey. Production ramped in the fever of 44, 200 units by VE day, shipped in oiled crates to subs from Drum to Wahoo, but the war's tide had turned on other levers. Long-range liberators bombing the pens at Lorient, hunter-killers like the Chatelaine ramming surfaced boats in dawn firefights. The Wren's reign waned, but its shadow lingered, a reminder that hesitation's bill came due in blood. Dr. Eleanor Briggs joined them, her lab coat traded for a wool greatcoat against the October bite, a clipboard clutched like a shield. The acoustic wizardry that had birthed Echo and mourned its burial now crowned the counterstroke, frequency agile guidance that shifted mid-run, dodging the enemy's countermeasures with a digital stutter borrowed from radar jammers. "It's lethal, Harold," she said, voice soft over the gull cries and mooring chains clinking. "But remember the cost. Zaunkönig killed 200 hulls before we countered. Our delay, that's on the ledgers too." Whitney's gaze drifted to the river's flow, where barges hauled depth charges bound for the fleet. Moral qualms, he thought bitterly, the Admiral's ghosts whispering from Thorne's grave. The old Jutland vet felled by a stroke in 43, his last words a mutter of uncontrollable. "We feared the wolf in the machine, the sea loosed it anyway." Nimitz, elevated to 5-star in Pacific Czar, had penned a terse commendation. Whitney's vision vindicated, deploy forthwith. But vindication tasted of rust, the Mark 32's first blood a footnote to the Foxer's frantic salvage. The deployment came swift, a dagger thrust into the Wolfpack's flank. Croker slipped her lines at dusk on October 15th, submerging into the autumn murk where the Gulf Stream met the Labrador Current in a clash of cold and warm. Grant conned her east at 200 feet, the boat's diesels silenced for the electric creep. Hydrophone operators, ears pricked like Ruiz in his Chatelaine days, scanning the baffles for the enemy's thrum. Intelligence from Bletchley painted the target, U-1223, a late-war Type Windsee Sear 40 fresh from the Baltic, her tubes fat with Zaunkönigs, prowling the convoy lane for SC-157 stragglers. 2 days out, contact, a faint cavitation whine at 220 hertz, bearing the 45, range 5,000 yards. Grant's voice over the 1MC was steel calm, battle stations submerged, weapons tight. The boat trembled as Croker angled up, periscope shearing the chop for a peek. U-1223 on the surface, decks awash, her snort mask trailing diesel smoke like a confession. Whitney, detailed as ordnance observer, hunched in the attack center, sweat beading despite the chill, watching the plot bloom. Prop signature match, the sonar chief confirmed. Type 1 Ank C, 240 Hz clean. She's blind to us, sir. The solution firmed. Gyro angle 320, depth 10 meters, speed 24 knots submerged, electric silent, no wake to betray. Grant tallied the spread. 2 Mark 32s, fan pattern to bracket. Match bearings, fire. Tubes 1 and 4 thumped, the fish ejecting in coils of air bubbles that dissipated like breath on glass. Echoes of echo, the torpedoes dove, hydrophones questing, locking on the U-boat's screws with a predatory click audible only in the minds of their makers. U-1223's watch, huddled against the spray, heard nothing, until the sea sang back. Kapitänleutnant Otto von Saldern, U-1223's skipper, was a veteran of the happy time, his log a litany of tonnage claimed from Halifax to Freetown. At 35, with a duelist's poise and eyes faded blue as faded ink, he paced the bridge, binoculars sweeping the empty horizon. "Nichts," he muttered to his fanrich, the night thick with fog that muffled even the diesel's growl. Below, the Zaunkönig tubes stood ready, a quartet of acoustic assassins for the next fat convoy. The Tommies falter, von Saldern thought, lighting a soggy Egyptian. Their noisemakers rust, our wrens sing eternal. Then, the whine, faint at first, building from astern like a counterpoint to his own props. Von Saldern spun, alarm klaxon wailing as the boat heeled into emergency dive. Alarm, tauchen! But the Mark 32s were tuned true, their noses drinking the 240 Hz dirge, veins biting water in a lethal pirouette. The first fish curved under the stern, proximity fuse pinging the keel's shadow at 15 meters. Boom! A thunderclap that crumpled the afterplanes, flooding the motor room in a torrent that shorted batteries and blew arcs. Von Saldern staggered, thrown against the conning tower ladder, the sea roaring up as the boat listed hard to starboard. The second struck forward, homing on the auxiliary diesel's frantic whine as damage parties scrambled. Torpex bloomed amidships, shearing the pressure hull in a screech of parting seams, the conning tower shearing off like a bottle cap. Von Saldern tumbled into the control room, tasted blood and oil, his last order a gargled Oberfläche before the lights died. U-1223 broached in agony, bow high, then plunged stern first, the thrum of her screws the final note in a requiem cut short. Croker's hydrophones drank the death song, air rushing from ballast tanks, bulkheads imploding in a cascade of crumps, the sea's indifferent glug-glug as she fed the floor. Grant surfaced Croker under cover of the fog bank, the Mark 32's telemetry confirming clean kills, no circular runs, no friendly ghosts. Whitney, pale in the red gloom, traced the scope's fading trace. "Lethal," Briggs had said. Late but lethal. The boat radioed the tally. 1 U-boat destroyed, acoustic torpedo verified. Nimitz's reply crackled back from Pearl, "Well done." Production doubled. The tide turns twice, but turning tides don't raise the drowned. By VE Day in May 45, the Mark 32 claimed 20 confirmed sinks. U-boats caught flat-footed in their own acoustic web, crews cursing the American Wren that turned their hunt on its ear. Whitney watched the war's end from White Oak's window, the Chesapeake flat as a mirror, reflecting a sky scrubbed clean by peace. Declassified reports trickled out in the 50s. Project Echo's blueprints, stamped "Invented 1942, shelved." Historians pored over them like relics, tallying the what-ifs. Had Whitney's fish deployed in 42, 500 hulls saved? The torch landings unhindered, North Africa bloodless? Thorne's successors, those bureau ghosts, faded into footnotes, their prudence recast as paralysis. Briggs retired to academia, lecturing on sound's double edge, innovation's crest and crash. Whitney? He sailed a desk till 48, then vanished to a cottage on the Severn, where he fished with hand lines and sketched waveforms on napkins. We feared its power, he'd murmur to the gulls, rod tip dipping to the thrum of current. They were right. The sea, that vast archive, kept its own counsel. Zaunkonig's wreckage rusting beside Foxer cans, Mark 32 husks tangled in the same weeds. Power delayed became power lost, hesitations echo louder than any prop. In the quiet years, as jets screamed overhead and missiles dreamed of autonomy, Whitney penned a letter to Nimitz, unposted, yellowing in a drawer. "We built the future in fear, Admiral. Next time, let it hunt free." The Admiral, island-hopping in memory, would have nodded. War's lessons were simple. The machine doesn't hesitate. Only men do. They feared its power. They were right. If you believe every forgotten invention deserves its story, subscribe for more untold Woe We 2 revelations.